Purpose of the CIA was to leave those people out of Langley. That's why they're not in Washington. They're in Northern Virginia, away from the White House, away from Congress. Leave them alone, ask them what they think, but don't tell them to rethink their positions, because then you come up with nonsense, like we saw.
The administration had decided very early on that Saddam should go, and that in itself is not a bad goal. But of course, everything depends on how you do it, when, how, where, with whom, etc.
Preemptive war by its very nature is something that is entirely new to the United States of America and to what we call the old Western Alliance. You go back through history, and at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, a group of nations that had just killed most of each other off decided that this isn't quite the way to do it, and they came up with a set of laws that we've all lived with fairly well since then, which doesn't much allow for preemptive war.
Delay in decision and inaction could lead to a massive and sudden horror.
It simply makes no sense to wait any longer.
Take action before it's too late. We will not wait. I believe it is essential that when we see a threat, we deal with those threats before they become imminent. It's too late if they become imminent.
As President Bush has said, time is not on our side.
It was a rushed NIE. It was done, I believe, in 3 or 4 weeks, which is really fast for that. It wasn't done earlier, from what I understand, because the Bush administration didn't want such a document that had caveats.
That's why they never asked for a comprehensive national intelligence estimate within the intelligence community on this particular problem, because they knew the intelligence community didn't agree on any of these issues.
The National Intelligence Estimate is really about, 5 major players, but 10 intelligence agencies in total, weighing in on the basic situation with weapons of mass destruction. It only happened because the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Graham, called for it. And so I think the Bush administration resisted having an NIE, and then once it was out, selectively picked what was useful to their argument.
Most of their qualifications were simply filtered out.
The sanitization of the original estimate was not true to its real meaning. All the modifiers were dropped off.
It was a prosecutor making a case, using what benefited his case, ignoring evidence that would undermine his case, and there was no defense attorney to give us the other side.
And the end product used by policymakers, particularly in its discussion with the American public, were much more forceful than could have possibly been when originally written by CIA, DIA, or State Department's intelligence and research.
It was a bizarre warping of the intelligence process, and they thought they would be able to get away with it because who's going to see the classified version? Well, later, several months later, they released parts of the classified version. They thought no one would notice.
So this was not a case where the National Intelligence Estimate was driving the war. This was to provide an excuse after the fact.
Going to war based on intelligence is yet another example, I think, of intelligence simply not being able by nature, by definition, to live up to that kind of requirement. You may produce intelligence that could keep you out of a war, but I doubt that you'll ever get 1, 2, 3 reports of intelligence that will in any way allow you to go to war.
They're Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Saddam Hussein cavorts with terrorists.
Secretly and without fingerprints, he could provide one of his hidden weapons to terrorists or help them develop their own.
Well, the war really had absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. There was no connection whatsoever between Iraq and the secular regime there and the religious fanatics who perpetrated 9/11.
They wanted to believe that there was a connection, but the CIA was sitting there, the FBI was sitting there, I was sitting there saying, we've looked at this issue for years. For years we've looked for a connection, and there's just no connection.
Saddam was not a maniac or a fool. He was a terrible villain, yes, but he was not going to sacrifice his own life and the future of his country to stupid adventures with terrorists who had completely antithetical views to his.
It is just inconceivable to anybody who understands Saddam Hussein and understands the nature of highly centralized dictatorships generally that dictators would want to give up control of their most potent weaponry. Because once you've given up control, you have no control. So you can't say to Al-Qaeda, you will use this or you won't use it. The decision on whether or not they're going to use it depends on what Osama bin Laden does. Do you want to entrust your fate to Osama bin Laden and his nihilistic ways? I don't think so. Saddam Hussein is a psychopath and a sociopath. He was not an irrational being in the sense that he was going to ensure his own demise by doing something like that.
Al-Qaeda has had total contempt for Saddam Hussein himself. He's been a socialist. He's been very harsh. He's treated Islamic leaders, Islamist leaders, extremely harshly.
Iraq, and we have very good intelligence on this, was not part of the picture of terrorism before we invaded. Saddam Hussein and bin Laden were enemies. Bin Laden considered and said that Saddam Hussein was the socialist infidel. These were very different kinds of individuals competing for power in their own way, and Saddam Hussein made very sure that Al-Qaeda couldn't function in Iraq, that terrorists couldn't function, except for the small northeastern quadrant of the country where there was an extremist group, but he had no control over that. It was near the Iranian border.
There's no doubt that Ansar al-Islam is a radical Islamic terrorist group with ties to Al-Qaeda, but they operate in a part of Iraq that is not controlled by Hussein. The leaders say they seek to overthrow Hussein and his government.
They are our enemy, or really they are also our enemy. We believe that Saddam Hussein, him and his group and his ministers also, they are outside of Islam's zone.
And the ties with Al-Qaeda was just a scare tactic to exploit the trauma, the very real trauma that the American people have felt ever since 9/11, and to associate that trauma with Iraq. As you know from the polls, most Americans believed that Iraq had something to do with 9/11, and it was a very successful, very deliberate, and very unethical and immoral operation on the part of the PR people of this administration.
We now know that Saddam has resumed his efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. Among other sources, we've gotten this from first-hand testimony from defectors.
Access to emigres and defectors with more direct access to these programs.
From 3 Iraqi defectors, we know that Iraq in the late 1990s had several mobile biological weapons labs.
It was only after defectors told us about it. Their inspectors were in the country.
The most important information that inspectors have ever gotten on what's going on in Iraq have come from defectors.
We know about that capability from defectors and other sources.
A recent defector stated that as recently as August of 1998, that's while inspections were still going on, a formal order was issued to proceed with the nuclear program at full blast.
Our strategy is to bring to the world the danger that Saddam poses in his current state.
Without doubt, he is developing weapons of mass destruction. Without doubt, he has chemical and biological weapons. And without doubt, for 30 years, he has been trying to acquire a nuclear weapon.
The usual scrutiny of these kind of guys was just not done adequately. That there was this attitude of let's find the smoking gun, let's find the evidence, rather than let's look at what's out there and weigh the evidence.
They wanted to believe him. It goes back to contacts that originated as early as the 1990s. With individuals like Dick Cheney, like Paul Wolfowitz, like Richard Pearl, dealing with Ahmed Chalabi. They became enamored of this fellow who dressed like a Westerner, talked with a British accent, and appeared to be upper crust, and therefore was quite believable.
And everyone in Washington was believing them. And I thought people had really somehow checked out of reality in order to go to war, that it was a war fever that had taken over.
These people wanted to get back into Baghdad. They couldn't defeat Saddam Hussein, but they knew that U.S. military power could. So the worst of these offenders, who would be Ahmad Chalabi, who's been in exile from his own country for 20 to 30 years and is clearly not a hero under any definition of heroism to his own people, sold the Pentagon on the idea that Saddam Hussein did have weapons of mass destruction and he must be stopped.
But they were bringing forward individuals who they claimed were either high-level military or scientists with access.
They were looking for money, first of all, because Chalabi was paying money.